America is negotiating parts of Europe's future, and increasingly it's doing so without Europe in the room. America's turn toward transactional politics has made one thing clear, I think. Europe is entering an era in which old certainties are dissolving and new realities must be confronted. Today, I want to unpack what that really means, not in the abstract, but for European states and especially for Switzerland. In this episode, I'm going to walk you through these three things: how and why the global order is becoming more transactional, what this shift means for small states like Switzerland, and what Switzerland should actually do in a world where power and deals matter more than rules. If you stay with me to the end, my goal is that you will be able to answer one core question. Can Switzerland and Europe survive in a system where rules no longer are reliable and protect small states, or an alliance as the European Union? We'll move from Washington and Eisenhower's diary to geoeconomics and weaponized interdependence, and then down to very concrete Swiss dilemmas. Hello and welcome to Geopolitically Correct. My name is Yannick Scheidegger. America's turn towards transactional politics has made one thing clear. Europe is entering an era in which old certainties are dissolving and new realities must be confronted. In brief, I think 3 points stand out. As Washington becomes more transactional, Europe can no longer take American support for granted, challenging a mindset that has shaped European security since 1945. The liberal international order that once protected small states is weakening, while geoeconomics and zero-sum bargaining shape global politics. And for Switzerland, this shift calls for clear strategic priorities, closer cooperation with Europe, and I think also a consistent approach to security, economy, and foreign policy. And some people in the current US administration see the European Union as something formed to screw the United States. Those who see it this way should take a closer look, I think, at chapter 7 of Eisenhower's diary, in which he writes, quoting him here, "Denmark, Holland, Belgium, Luxembourg, France, Italy, and Western Germany should form one federated state. To help this, America could afford to spend a lot because we'd get something successful, strong, sturdy." End of quote. A strong and sturdy Europe is in America's interest, and Washington has invested a lot of energy and hope in this project. But this quote also shows how great the contrast is between the thinking in Washington then and now. While Eisenhower wrote down his thoughts on November 24th, 1951, the current US administration is coldly ignoring European in negotiations on the future of the continent. In my view, this is not an isolated case, but a trend, perhaps even a change of era. The United States has become transactional, and in response, more and more countries are following suit. Understanding and adapting to the nature of this emerging order or disorder will be central to the success of European states. I think this is particularly true for Switzerland as a small state. If states become more transactional, Switzerland cannot rely on international law to protect it as much as before. So let's look more closely at what actually is changing and why it matters so directly for Switzerland. Over the past decade, the global order has shifted away from the relatively stable liberal international order that emerged in the aftermath of the Second World War under US leadership. That order, with its institutional norms and long-term commitments, created stability for wealth, stability for prosperity in many parts of the world. The future direction of this order is now unclear. Some experts offer different perspectives, so depending on which experts you ask, you get a different answer. Some see a more fragmented multipolarity, others renewed systemic rivalry, others the emergence of a new Cold War. I think a quote from Antonio Gramsci fits this current state quite well. He observed that, quoting him here, the crisis consists precisely in the fact that the old is dying and the new cannot be born. In this interregnum, a great variety of morbid symptoms appear. End of quote. And I think it's a fitting description of the current era. The international order is neither stable nor predictable. It is a mixture of different aspects, and this is typical of a period when the order is transitioning from old to new. At the beginning of this year, Ravi Agrawal, editor-in-chief of Foreign Policy, published an article that I found instructive. Trump is ushering in a more transactional world. He argues that the current international system increasingly reflects a transactional logic. The US president is often described as transactional, and if we revisit Trump's The Art of the Deal, we see that interactions are framed as fundamentally zero-sum. One side wins, the other loses. Elements of this mindset are clearly visible in contemporary US foreign policy. The implication is that international politics is increasingly conducted as a series of deals, we can say, rather than based on long-term rules or institutions. And one example of this is the way in which Washington is handling the talks to end the war in Ukraine. According to a Wall Street Journal report or article, individuals such as Witkoff, Kushner, and Dmitriev have considered ways to reintegrate parts of Russia's $2 trillion economy on the basis that American companies could be among the first to benefit. And regardless of one's views on the feasibility or politics or even morality of such proposals, the underlying logic shows a broader trend. Complex geopolitical matters are being packaged up as a transactional deal. Not all observers agree on how representative this case is. That also has to be said. Some argue that it is a reflection of individual decisions rather than a systematic US strategy. However, in my view, transactionalism reflects a deeper shift in the international system, and for me, three trends stand out. And if you stay with me for these, the Swiss dilemmas we'll discuss later will make much more sense. The first trend is the erosion, or as some would say, the gradual disintegration of the liberal international order. This was evident during Trump's speech at this year's UN General Assembly, in which he repeatedly implied that international institutions are not neutral platforms, but rather elements of a system that works against US interests. The point here is not to evaluate these claims, but to acknowledge that the current US leadership no longer considers the liberal international order to be a strategic objective. This change alone weakens the order, and of course, scholars have been warning of this for some time. John Ikenberry, for example, described a crisis of the liberal international order several years ago. Others argue that the global system is fragmenting into overlapping coalitions rather than functioning as a coherent regime. This does not necessarily imply collapse, since the liberal order remains resilient in certain areas. That said, the underlying trend is unmistakable: fewer shared rules and more ad hoc interest-based cooperation. The second trend is the use of economic tools as instruments of state power, a concept often referred to as geoeconomics, where trade, financial and technological controls are used to promote national interests. The United States has adopted this approach through its tariffs policy, but it is by no means alone. States are exploiting economic interdependence to gain leverage. They exploit critical knots. These are also called choke points, which are points where a single entity controls an essential link and can slow down, block, or restrict access to it. States can also impose export and investment controls, weaponize supply chains and critical technologies, and use industrial policy to advance not only domestic growth but also geopolitical objectives. The distinction between economic and security policy is becoming increasingly blurred, a process often referred to as the securitization of economic policy. The easiest way to understand, I think, this shift is to view international politics as a marketplace. Countries ask, what do I give? What will I get in return? What do I want in return? This logic now shapes the behavior not only of major powers, but also of smaller states, including Switzerland. And the third trend is that this transactional logic is no longer just out there among the big players. It is increasingly visible in Switzerland's own foreign policy behavior. One example is the US airstrike on Iranian nuclear enrichment facilities. This strike violated principles of international law. And in the past, the Directorate of International Law at the Federal Department of Foreign Affairs in Switzerland would have swiftly condemned the attack. This time, however, there was no such reaction. Switzerland was in the middle of negotiations regarding the 39% tariffs, and Bern seemingly preferred to avoid endangering a potential deal. This is an illustration, I would say, of transactional behavior. And of course, some may argue that it reflects pragmatic crisis management rather than a broader structural change. However, this pattern repeats itself across multiple policy domains, suggesting, I think, that something deeper is at work. I think these trends reveal the foundations of a transactional world order, characterized by the erosion of the liberal international order, the rise of geoeconomics, the rise of statecraft, using economics as a tool of statecraft, and growing transactionalism within Switzerland's own foreign policy. And this brings us directly to the key question. In a world of deals and leverage, where does a small state like Switzerland stand? In a transactional world, smaller states tend to lose out. This is not a new insight. For a long time, scholars such as Robert Keohane and Baldur Thorhallsson have argued that small states depend disproportionately on stable rules and predictable institutions. A transactional world is hierarchical. Market size and power matter. Despite imposing wide-ranging tariffs, for example, the United States can absorb, at least for now, the economic shock. Its stock market, for example, remains above where it stood earlier in the year. The logic is straightforward. Large states can impose costs on others and remain relatively unscathed. In contrast, small states lack a key lever in geoeconomic competition, a large domestic market capable of generating pressure. Switzerland has strategic strengths in niche areas, that's true, but these rarely compensate for the fundamental imbalance. And in this environment, Switzerland will need clear priorities. But some areas of Swiss policy are currently poorly aligned, creating vulnerabilities in a transactional world. Daniel Möckli, director of the Center for Security Studies in Zurich, has identified in his research that Switzerland's strategy is pulled in three different directions. So let's get quickly through them. So in security policy, security planners seek deeper cooperation with Europe, increasing distance from Russia and to some extent from China, which Swiss intelligence now views as a growing risk. Economic policy continues to prioritize global market access. This includes updating the free trade agreement with China, for example. And also when the EU introduced its 18th sanctions package against Russia, Switzerland notably declined to adopt the measures targeting Chinese banks. Then foreign policy, more broadly, the FDFA promotes the concept of global Switzerland while emphasizing the importance of maintaining stable relations with the EU. During the 2025 strategic dialogue with China, Switzerland agreed to strengthen its innovative strategic partnership with China. and expressed its support for China's new global governance initiative, a proposal that many Western governments view as an attempt to reshape international norms. These contradictions reduce Switzerland's room for maneuver. As the world becomes more transactional, it becomes more difficult to have your cake and eat it. In Switzerland, we would say to get the Fünfer und Zweckli. And given its cultural and political alignment, Switzerland's long-term strategic orientation lies with Europe, including closer cooperation with EU security programs and NATO structures. This alignment is important as the multilateral protective shield weakens. And traditionally, institutions such as the UN, WTO, and OEC have offered small states stability and rules to restrain the behavior of major powers. However, as these organizations lose effectiveness, Switzerland will become more dependent on regional and bilateral partnerships, particularly stable relations with the European Union, I believe. Switzerland is vulnerable to geoeconomic and technological risks. Only a few firms, for example, in the US, Taiwan, and the Netherlands manufacture the world's most advanced semiconductors, and US export rules determine who can access them. Henry Farrell and Abraham Newman refer to this as weaponized interdependence. When the US tightened controls on chip exports to China, Beijing responded by restricting exports of critical rare earths. And this shows how interdependence can become a political weapon and how rapidly escalation can occur. Switzerland cannot respond on an equal footing, of course, without a large domestic market or coercive economic tools. The country risks becoming increasingly dependent on the rules set by others. So the question becomes, what can Switzerland actually do? Let's turn to that question. Switzerland needs a clearer understanding of its geopolitical dependencies in a world where trade, technology, and supply chains can be weaponized. Foreign and economic policy must be guided in such a world by a systematic assessment of these dependencies and how easily they could be exploited. Addressing these vulnerabilities requires a coherent economic security strategy, stronger protection for critical infrastructure, and more diversified supply chains. It also requires foreign policy priorities that reflect today's geopolitical realities. For decades, Switzerland could rely on international law, multilateral institutions, and neutrality for protection. And since 2022, however, this has changed. Switzerland, for example, now has to constantly explain its neutrality, often to skeptical audiences. Whether neutrality still offers the same strategic benefits in a transactional world is an open question that requires the honest and broad policy debate in Switzerland. Bern needs greater coherence between its security, economic, and foreign policies. While each department's strategies are logical in isolation, they diverge from a coherent Swiss strategy. As geopolitical tensions rise, the cost of these contradictions will increase. To strengthen its position in Europe, Switzerland should deepen its cooperation with both the EU and NATO. This can be achieved through joint procurement and data sharing, capability development, and participation in PESCO projects and initiatives such as the European Sky Shield initiative, which Switzerland is already part of. At the same time, it must also strengthen its own defense capabilities. Even if the war in Ukraine eventually ends, Europe's security environment will remain fragile, and US involvement in European affairs is likely to decline. This raises the question of financing, with options ranging from a 0.5 increase in the value-added tax to targeted exemptions from the debt brake. Above all, Switzerland must be prepared to make difficult compromises. The 15% tariff deal reflects this. The strategic rationale was clear. Small states sometimes need pragmatic flexibility to protect their interests. The challenge lies in balancing pragmatism with preserving Swiss values. If you remember only one thing from this section, let it be this: neutrality and law alone are no longer enough. Switzerland needs strategy. Let me conclude with this. To adapt to a more transactional world, Switzerland must recognize its geopolitical dependencies and vulnerabilities. It must prepare for a world in which rules are being challenged by creating greater coherence across its policies, strengthening its partnerships within Europe, and being ready to make decisions based on its interests when necessary. A return to an international liberal order would undoubtedly benefit small states such as Switzerland. In the meantime, however, the country will need to adapt to a world in which power and transactional behavior play a far greater role. And that is the core challenge. How does a small, prosperous, rule-trusting country learn to think and act strategically in a system that is becoming more and more transactional and more disordered? That in mind, let me know what you think. And if you enjoyed this video, then do perhaps give it a like. Consider subscribing, as I try to push and make sure we're aware of what's happening, especially in Europe, of these big picture developments and how they frame the geopolitical changes and economic ones as well. And if you want to support me further, then do consider checking the links out below, where you can buy me a coffee, support me on Substack, or become a member on the channel. I'll see you all next time. Take care.